The first sound is not the wind, but iron on stone. A hammer finds the groove of a chisel and drives it forward, shaving a civer from a cartouche that once declared a living god. Dust feathers into hot air. In a broken colonnade at Karnak, the hieroglyphs ripple like the Nile under a sudden breeze, except this current is erasure. Names become scratches. Faces become weather. The men at work do not speak much. They do not need to. They have orders and time and the confidence that only restoration bestows. Once these same walls absorbed hymns to Amun in perfumed incense and drumbeat. Now they drink in the dry rasp of unnaming. Across the river and far to the north, in a city raised for the sun alone, Talatat blocks, Bishkak, the small standardized stones that built a revolution quickly are pried from one purpose and slid into another. Door lintels in new temples hide within their cores the dismantled bones of Akhenaten. A god who once required open sky is now buried inside someone else's roof. The Egyptians feared two deaths. The first was the closing of the eyes and the sealing of the mouth, a matter for embalmers, priests, and proper words. The second was more terrible. It came when the name itself failed, when no lips spoke it, no hand traced it, no inscription preserved it. To blot a cartouche was to murder a soul all over again. Here, under the bleaching light of Upper Egypt, the second death proceeds in patient strokes. You can taste chalk and old sunlight on your tongue. A line of workers moves along a wall as if along a ledger, striking out a balance that history is no longer willing to carry. Where a royal profile once flared with the curve of a chin and the ribbon of a crown, there is only a raw hollow, like a socket after a tooth has been levered loose. Before we continue, if this tale keeps you company tonight, leave a like and subscribe, only if it truly feels natural. And now softly tell me, where are you listening from, and what hour has the night brought you? They work at Karnak because power needs legibility where power has always been read. They work at Amarna because forgetting must be thorough. The new regime calls it restoration, a return to balance after an experiment that turned the world sideways. The old gods are back in procession. The barks of Amun-Mut and Khonsu sway again. Festivals resume with beer and bread and the consolations of reliable ritual. The priests count cattle and land allotments as they once did. Scribes update king lists in careful columns, and between the column that reads Amun-Hotep III and the one that reads Horemheb, they place a silence as neat as a rule-drawn line. A span of years vanishes into that silence, years in which a man changed his name and with it attempted to change what the sky meant. Walk the avenue of ram-headed sphinxes, and you will still feel the symmetry, still sense the old gravity of a city that survived the ambition of its kings. But listen closely and you can hear a different rhythm beneath the sandals and the sweeping of rush brooms. It is the rhythm of subtraction. Reliefs that once showed a family beneath radiating hands, each ray tipped, with an ankh, a miniature gesture of life, now show only the radiance with nothing to bless. The rays touch an absence. The daughters who held finger to mouth in the impatient gesture of childhood have been softened by the chisel into wind-polished streaks. The queen whose face once met the king's cheek to cheek in a tenderness Egypt's art had long denied its rulers has become a pale oval, a ghost of affection. At Amarna the wind speaks louder. The city lies like a stopped sentence along the east bank, its punctuation all fallen out. You can still trace the royal road, wide and purposeful, where chariots rattled between palaces. In the palace debris you find the painted fragments of marsh reeds and bright birds. The king had wanted nature itself on the walls, not the thick shadow of sanctuaries. In the open courts of the great Aten temple, no roof ever dared come between god and worshipper. There were only altars under sky, a theology made of light and witness. Now there are broken offering tables with sun baked into their cracks. Lizards claim the thresholds. The city's horizon still performs its daily miracle. The cliffs cradle the dawn like a bowl catching fire. But the god whose name once rode that flame has been folded back into the older words for sun, the older stories for order, the older comfort of plurality. Erasure makes its own story, and it is easy to be lulled by the logic of what remains. You see a chisel-cut scar and accept the verdict written in it. Aberration corrected, yet in the scrape of metal you can hear the outline of the man they are chasing across stone. He is already dead. He has been dead for months, perhaps a year, without funeral drama for the record keepers to relish. But the fervour of the deletion suggests that his propositions still feel alive. Decrees are easiest to reverse, walls are slower, minds are slower still. A regime can close a temple with a seal and reopen another with the same wax. It cannot as quickly unteach the feeling of standing in a courtyard at dawn and believing that one's breath and one's god draw from the same single source of heat. What survives in a city designed for sunlight Oddly, the shadows. They pool in the cutouts left by stolen reliefs in the hollows, where gold leaf once held and now catches only dust. They gather in the gaps of the king lists, and in the hesitations of courtiers who remember feasts held under blue-painted ceilings, where painted swallows dipped and turned. They deepen around the questions people will not speak aloud, whether the sickness in the palace was mere rumour, or whether those elongated skulls and narrow limbs were true, whether the god's command required girls to be more than daughters, whether an empire can pray itself safe while its vassals write for archers who do not come. The men at Karnak keep chiselling. A supervisor dips a reed pen and smudges an instruction on a shard. A boy fetches water and does not look up at the faces coming down, perhaps because he has already learned what the grown men have not, that this is how memory behaves in Egypt. It is tended. It is gardened. Weeds of novelty are pulled with vigour when the season changes. Then the beds are smoothed and the familiar shoots encouraged, and the gardener says, "Look order as it has always been." The Nile rises and the fields receive it and the statues wear wreaths again. Turn now from the dust and the deleted names. Step back through the door of time while it is still ajar, while the last chip falls from the last offended sign. Before the erasing hands there were hands that traced. Before the nameless spaces there were letters entrusted with power. The story that is being made to disappear began long before this campaign against it, and it did not at first announce itself as treason against 3,000 years. It began with a boy who watched the same sun his grandparents had praised with older names, and felt in the narrow hush of dawn a pressure behind his ribs. He was not yet the heretic whom future scribes would refuse to write. He was Amenhotep IV, son of a king whose reign had been so steady the calendar itself seemed to keep time by his breath. Thebes in that earlier light was a city confident in its repetitions. The pylons of the great temples rose like man-made cliffs painted with gods who were also principles, fertility craft, the measured breath of justice. Amun's priesthood counted offerings by the wagon, their estates outspread like shadow at noon. Their voices were soft but carried well. The boy prince moved through this world as through a script already drafted for him. He learned the hieroglyphs whose shapes promised duration. He learned how to face generals and how to face gods. He learned where the sun rose over the river and how its light bellied against the western tombs in evening. He learned the names of the foreign kings who sent lapis and cedar and daughters. He also learned something he could not recite to tutors. In quiet moments on a rooftop in the white heat in the cool breath of a colonnade. Before the crowds arrived, his gaze fixed on the disc itself, not on the falcon that wore it, not on the many faces that tradition had fitted to its blaze. The disc gave and it took and nothing stood between. Perhaps it was only a feeling, a wordless compression of awe. Perhaps it was the kind of thought that comes to many and is dismissed by most, because it is inconvenient to a world already furnished with explanations. Yet in him it lodged and would not move. When he walked the precinct of Amun, the smell of incense thick enough to taste when he watched a procession swallow and release a god hidden in a shrine. When he saw farmers knot cords around the forelegs of oxen bound for a festival slaughter. His mind tilted slightly, then more. He loved the same Nile and the same green flood of fields that everyone loved. He wore the same collars of faience and gold. But the private sun in him grew, and as it grew, the rooms around him felt too crowded with intermediaries. The boy became a young man, and the sunlight passing through the hyperstyle forest of Karnak became a kind of instruction. Columns are beautiful, shadows are soothing, secrets are powerful. But what if there should be no ceiling at all? What if the god wanted no walls? He did not yet have the courage to say it. He did not yet have the leverage. Armies still stood waiting for his signal in Nubia and in the Syrian marches. The court still expected him to be the next careful stone on the cairn of kings. For a while he was exactly that, and the priest smiled. He ordered as dutiful kings do a little shrine and then a larger one. He commissioned artists, and without saying why, allowed them to loosen their grip on the old grammar of faces and poses to let breath into stone. The changes were small and deniable, a look traded between husband and wife, a child reaching up with sticky fingers, the son's arms ending not in daggers but in open hands. A single thought can change the angle of a civilization. It is not always clear when the thought begins to act. Later men with chisels will be sure they know where to place the mark that says here. But the beginning is quieter. It is a prince standing still a little too long after everyone else has moved on, eyes narrowed against the glare at the horizon, feeling something arrange itself behind the brightness like a plan. The hammer falls at Karnak, the dust rises, the name curls away from stone, and we step into the light before the erasers came into the moment when a young ruler began to imagine that the sun itself could be a simpler language for God, and that if he listened closely it was speaking to him alone. Father Amenhotep III had ruled for nearly 4 decades with a mastery so complete that foreign kings sent not armies, but letters of friendship daughters for marriage, and gifts in quantities that dazzled even the meticulous scribes who counted them. Gold from Nubia flowed like water into Thebes, cedar beams floated down the coast from Byblos, lapis and turquoise flashed from distant mines, palaces gleamed with frescoes of lotus and papyrus of hunting scenes, where the king himself always triumphed, his bow as sure as the sunrise. Thebes in those years was not just a city, it was a statement that Egypt's gods favoured her above all the earth. For a royal child, life was scripted in layers of ritual. The young prince was instructed in the arts of reading and writing hieroglyphs, not as a scribe would, but enough to appreciate the density of sacred words. Tutors drilled him in mathematics to prepare him for the language of architecture and astronomy, to read the heavens as a clock for the gods in the histories of battles, so he might command soldiers with inherited confidence. Every morning the servants adjusted the folds of his linen, so that no crease could insult the dignity of his bloodline. Every evening he walked halls where murals showed his ancestors embracing gods, each pharaoh's face rendered in eternal perfection, strong chin, muscular torso, ageless calm. But when attendants whispered that he did not look quite like those images, there was unease. Even as a child, Amenhotep IV's frame was long and narrow. His head seemed slightly elongated, his limbs thin, his hips broad in a way that unsettled the sculptors who would later try to capture him. Court gossip is impossible to recover in detail, but archaeologists and physicians today debate whether a genetic disorder shaped his body, perhaps Marfan syndrome, perhaps something else. Whatever the cause, the effect was the same: the boy stood apart. Where other princes grew into the heroic proportions of painted reliefs, he grew sideways strangely, and Egypt's artists, bound to tradition, quietly smoothed his features to fit the timeless template. Behind those corrections lay a nervous question: could such a body house a god-king? The prince's tutors may have tried to compensate with rigour. He learned how to hold a bow even if his arms shook after too long. He learned how to speak with generals, though his interest waned quickly. He learned the lists of deities: Amun, king of gods, whose temple at Karnak swallowed more wealth than many kingdoms; Mut, the mother goddess; Khonsu, the moon-child. Festivals paraded their statues through Thebes, carried on gilded barks amid clouds of incense. The priests of Amun orchestrated it all, commanding thousands of labourers and treasuries fattened with tribute. Their power was so immense that foreign rulers wrote directly to them, knowing the high priest could sway Egypt's policies almost as surely as the king. For a child in such an environment, it was impossible not to see where the true gravity lay. Even the pharaoh's palace seemed to bow to the sprawling temple next door, and yet something restless flickered in the boy. Perhaps it was in the school of temple hymns where alongside Amun's praises lingered older verses to the Aten, the visible sun disk, mostly neglected but still sung on the certain mornings. Perhaps it was during conversations with foreign envoys who brought tales from the Levant of peoples whispering about one god above many. Or perhaps it was more private still, the moments when he stood in a courtyard and tilted his face upward. There, without incense, without priests, without statues, the sun burned through the sky with a clarity that made every ritual around it seem like embroidery on plain cloth. Thebes was a city designed to overwhelm the senses. Karnak's hyper-style hall with its forest of papyrus bundle columns could make any man feel small as an insect. But the boy's gaze lingered not in the shadows of the columns, but in the patches of light between them. He noticed how the sun slid along the stone, how dust motes spun in its beams, how warmth itself seemed a kind of language. The priests spoke of hidden mysteries of gods who could not be seen except through their avatars. Yet here was something visible, immediate, undeniable. The disk rose every morning without prayers and set every evening without offerings. Its cycle was older than any dynasty, more constant than any throne. Still, doubts like these were not spoken aloud. In the palace he played his role. At festivals he bowed with the rest, his androgynous frame hidden in pleated linen, his lips repeating words meant to bind him to the tradition of 3,000 years. But somewhere behind his eyes that artists later carved, as almond-shaped, elongated, and always watching questions grew. What if the god of gods was not in the sanctum of Karnak, but above it? What if the entire machinery of priest sacrifices and wealth was a veil that obscured rather than revealed the divine? This was the seed of unease. A prince raised in abundance, surrounded by tutors and traditions designed to secure continuity, found himself looking past them. Others saw a slightly awkward young man, lanky, strangely shaped, prone to staring into the light. He himself, though he could not yet put it into words, felt that the light stared back. That sense that the sun itself addressed him was the quiet fracture line along which the might of Thebes would one day split. For now he carried it silently through corridors painted with the perfect bodies of kings he would never resemble toward a future that would demand he not resemble them at all. When the boy became pharaoh, Egypt expected continuity. The officials, the generals, the scribes, all assumed that Amenhotep IV would walk the same well-laid avenue his father had paved on Amun, maintain order, fund the temples, keep the empire secure. And at first, outwardly, he did. Ceremonies were performed, titles confirmed, tributes collected. But beneath the polished surface of tradition, small tremors began. They did not roar as decrees. They whispered as images, as stones newly placed in old soil. In his first years as King, Amenhotep IV sponsored shrines to attend the sun disk. That was not unprecedented. Aten had long been one facet of the solar god Ra, one mask among many in the pantheon. What startled courtiers was where the shrines rose. Not in some forgotten province or marginal desert plain, but in Thebes itself, under the looming shadow of Karnak, the stronghold of Amun's priests. The placement was deliberate. Every time sunlight spilled across the pylons of Amun's temple, it also struck Aten's altars, as if two rival suns contested the same horizon. These early temples were unlike anything Egypt had built before. Traditional sanctuaries were enclosed, their innermost chambers, dark and narrow, meant to preserve mystery and protect the god from profane sight. Aten's courts, by contrast, had no roofs. They were open to the sky, demanding that worshippers stand bareheaded before the disk. Offerings piled on long rows of tables under direct sunlight. The god's presence was not hidden in a shrine, but visible every morning, every noon, every evening. A theology of shadows was being traded for a theology of light. Even more shocking than the architecture was the art that accompanied it. For 3,000 years, Egyptian art had been a grammar of eternity. Pharaohs were carved with muscular torsos, square shoulders, eternal youth, perfect symmetry. Queens appeared distant statuesque, aloof, their gestures frozen in hieratic calm. Children were barely depicted at all or shown as miniature adults, without play or vulnerability. The purpose was to escape time to render kings and gods in the stillness of forever. But in the reliefs commissioned by Amenhotep IV, something new appeared. The royal family was shown beneath the sun's rays, each beam ending in tiny open hands, offering ankhs, the sign of life, directly to their noses and mouths. The king was not rigid and ageless, but elongated, with drooping chin, narrow limbs, and wide hips. His queen Nefertiti stood beside him, not as a remote emblem of fertility, but as an equal partner, touching his hand, gazing into his eyes. Their daughters clambered over laps, tugged at jewellery, reached with outstretched fingers toward their parents. One princess leaned against her mother's shoulder, lips puckered in what could only be a kiss. No artist in centuries had dared show such intimacy on temple walls. To us accustomed to portraits and family scenes, these images may seem charming, even gentle. To Egyptians of the 14th century BC, they were disorienting, almost offensive. Gods were not supposed to laugh. Pharaohs were not supposed to wrinkle their necks as they bent to kiss their children. A queen was not supposed to lean close enough that her profile almost touched her husband's. Eternity had always been the goal, and eternity was solemn. Here, by contrast, was time itself captured, a moment of play, a gesture of affection, a child squirming mid-motion. To eyes trained by millennia of sacred formalism, it was a revolution. Why did he allow this? Perhaps it was conviction that a God who was visible to all did not need masks of perfection, but truth of presence. Perhaps it was strategy that showing himself as a father and husband softened the sharpness of his theological break. Or perhaps it was compulsion, the same restless gaze that once lingered on the sun disk, now insisted that art should tell not the lie of eternity, but the fleeting, radiant truth of a moment. Whatever the reason, the change spread quickly. Sculptors trained to repeat the old formulas were ordered to abandon them. Painters found themselves sketching children tugging hair or reaching for food. The stiff angles of divine kingship gave way to curves and motion. Some courtiers must have stood in those new temples and felt unease churn. Here was the pharaoh once imagined as perfect and godlike, rendered in lines that emphasized his strangeness. his thin limbs, his unusual skull. The image could be read as deformity as much as divinity, and here were his daughters not veiled away but thrust into public stone as symbols of a new theology. Even their names announced it: Akhenaten, beloved of Aten. Akhenaten. She lives for Aten. To look at the reliefs was to see not just a family, but a creed. Years 1 through 4 of Amenhotep IV's reign looked calm on the surface. Tribute still flowed, the army remained in garrisons, foreign envoys still arrived at Thebes, but inside the temples and palaces something irreversible had begun. An invisible line was being crossed, not with proclamations, but with chisels and brushes. To an Egypt that valued the eternal mask, its king was daring to show his face. To a nation that trusted gods concealed in dark sanctuaries, he opened the sky and declared, "Look up, the sun itself is enough." She steps out from the walls, not as a silhouette, but as a presence. Nefertiti, the beautiful one has come, was no mere consort tucked into the background of reliefs. From the very start of Amenhotep IV's experimental, she was carved into stone beside him, equal in scale, equal in gesture, often equal in devotion. In images that scandalize tradition, she stands almost shoulder to shoulder with the king beneath the radiating hands of Aten. While earlier queens appeared tiny behind their husbands, or anonymous in the background of temple processions, Nefertiti gazes into the same light, holds the same offerings, breathes in the same ankhs as her pharaoh. Egypt had not seen a queen made so visible since Hatshepsut, and even she had disguised herself in male regalia. Nefertiti appeared as a woman, tall, graceful, her features sharpened into the unforgettable bust that would one day emerge from Amarna's ruins into Berlin's museum halls. The new art did more than flatter her beauty. It declared a partnership. Where the old gods were countless, the new theology placed one god above all, and beneath that god, one family. Aten's rays did not bless the generals, the priests, or the scribes. They fell only on the king, the queen, and their daughters. The message was unmistakable. Divinity flowed through the royal house alone, embodied in the marriage bond and in the children it produced. Nefertiti's presence on the temple walls was not a courtesy, it was doctrine. She was the mirror to the king's devotion, the feminine counterpart to his strange body, the visible mother in a creed that proclaimed Aten both father and mother of creation. Their daughters, too, were more than children. The names chosen for them were confessions in stone. Akhenaten, beloved of Aten. Akhenaten, she lives for Aten. Neferuaten Tasheret, the younger beauty of Aten. Each name was a sermon proof that even in the nursery the god was sovereign. When courtiers saw reliefs of these girls reaching up toward their parents, they saw not only domestic affection, but a new hierarchy. Egypt's future queens and mothers of heirs were woven directly into the theology. The family itself had become liturgy, a living altar under the sky. For ordinary Egyptians, the impact must have been double-edged. On one hand, the sight of a king kissing his wife or cradling his daughters was startlingly human, perhaps even comforting. After centuries of stiffly idealized monarchs, here was a household that looked, if not like their own, at least capable of tenderness. In painted reliefs, children fidgeted and tugged, as real children did in courtyards across the land. Some may have looked on and felt pride that their ruler too loved and laughed as they did, but others, especially those steeped in the old festivals, may have felt the distance widen. Where once gods mingled with multitudes in public celebration, now the blessings of the sun fell on one family alone. What seemed intimate could also seem exclusionary. Imagine a farmer visiting Thebes hoping to glimpse the pharaoh during a festival. Instead of seeing Amun's bark swaying through crowded streets, he found altars under blazing sky, where only the royal family basked in rays that ended in tiny hands. He might squint and marvel at the artistry, the curve of the queen's neck, the affectionate bend of the king, but he might also wonder where his own gods had gone. Isis, who heard the cries of mothers, Osiris, who promised fields beyond death, Bes, who guarded households from harm, all were silent in this new vision. In their place, a single distant sun poured its favour onto a household far removed from his own. Still, Nefertiti's magnetism could not be denied. To courtiers she was both beauty and power, a partner whose image multiplied almost as widely as the king's. To foreign envoys she was a queen whose visibility signalled stability and abundance. And to later memory she would become one of Egypt's most enduring figures, her name surviving long after Aten's cult had turned to dust. In her lifetime she embodied a revolution at once, mother, lover, co-ruler and high priestess beneath the blazing sky. And in every scene where she and her husband leaned toward one another, hands lifted in worship, the boundary between private tenderness and public theology blurred into a new kind of sacred image, the royal family as the living temple of a god who needed no walls. If religion was the face of Egypt, its economy was the body, and the two were knotted so tightly that to strike at one was to wound the other. The cult of Amun was not just a matter of hymns and incense, it was an empire within the empire. By the time Amenhotep IV took the throne, the high priests of Amun controlled wealth on a staggering scale. Records carved into stone tally holdings that rivaled the crown itself. More than 80,000 labourers and slaves, herds of cattle counted in the hundreds of thousands, and agricultural estates covering nearly a third of Egypt's fertile land. Fields of barley and emmer, vineyards and orchards, fish ponds and fax plots all yielded their tribute not to the king directly but to the temple of Amun. Caravans laden with gold from Nubia, cedar from Lebanon, and incense from Punt were routed through Karnak's storerooms before a fraction reached the royal treasury. Imagine standing before Karnak at dawn when the gates opened and a stream of workers filed in, scribes clutching their pallets, herdsmen driving cattle, bakers carrying baskets of bread, boatmen unloading jars of wine from foreign ports. The temple was not only a sanctuary, it was the beating heart of Egypt's economy, employing tens of thousands, feeding them and commanding their loyalty. In such a system, the line between God and government blurred. Amun's priests were administrators, bankers, landlords, and politicians. To honour Amun was to honour prosperity itself. It was this machine that the young king began to unpick when he elevated Aten. At first, it may have seemed harmless, another god gaining favour, another shrine decorated. Egypt had always been a land of countless deities where one could add without taking away. But by building Aten's temples within sight of Karnak, Amenhotep IV signalled that his new devotion was not additive, but competitive. And when offerings were redirected from Amun's altars to Aten's tables, the meaning became unmistakable. Wealth was shifting. The priests understood the danger instantly. Their power was not rooted only in belief, but in cattle tallies and land ledgers. To lose offerings was to lose silver bread and legitimacy. They resisted not with open rebellion that would have been suicidal, but with silence, with subtlety. Inscriptions praising Amun multiplied quietly in the provinces. At festivals, some statues may have been paraded longer, hymns sung louder, as if to remind the people who had truly blessed them for centuries. When foreign tribute arrived, temple accountants made sure to remind donors whose god had protected their caravans across deserts and seas. At court, anxiety thickened. Officials who owed their fortunes to temple estates whispered in corridors. Generals knew that their pay, often drawn from Amun's revenues, could dry if offerings were diverted. Even scribes trained in both sacred texts and economic records could see the arithmetic turning dangerous. To undermine Amun was to destabilize Egypt's balance sheet, a balance that had held since the Middle Kingdom. And yet the king pressed forward. His early reforms were not proclamations but reallocations. Tribute that once filled Amun's warehouses found new homes in Aten's. Priests who managed estates discovered that their labourers were being reassigned, their fields marked for Aten's use. To the people working those fields, the change may have been little more than a different seal stamped on their rations, but to the priesthood it was theft of a cosmic order. A quiet war began. The priests tightened their networks, leaning on provincial temples and allies in bureaucracy. Rumours, those most ancient of weapons, spread that Aten's cult endangered the balance of the universe, that crops might fail without Amun's favour, that foreign enemies watched with greedy eyes while Egypt quarrelled with itself. Each rumour repeated in a marketplace or a tavern sowed doubt, and doubt was poison to a king who sought to replace a god worshipped for 3 millennia with one who had only recently been lifted from obscurity. Thebes glittered, as always, its processions dazzling, its markets noisy, but underneath the surface lay unease. Farmers wondered if their tithes would be accepted by Aten's priests. Merchants asked which god's blessing they should invoke on contracts. Soldiers looked at their pay and prayed it would continue. A theological quarrel had become a fiscal crisis in slow motion, threatening not just beliefs but bread. And as the sun rose each day, Aten's light fell evenly on the temples of both gods. To the priests of Amun that light was insult. To the young pharaoh it was vindication. He alone, it seemed, could interpret the meaning of a disk that shone on cattle herds, temple columns, and palace walls alike. But the economy of the gods had no patience for visions. It demanded stability numbers and predictable tribute. By daring to reroute the flow of offerings, the king was not simply declaring a new theology, he was tugging at the roots of power that had fed Egypt for centuries. In the 5th year of his reign, the young king stood before Egypt and performed an act more dangerous than any battle. He abandoned his name. To shed Amenhotep Amun is satisfied was to break the contract that bound him to his ancestors to Karnak, to the wealth and power of the great god's priesthood. In its place he chose Akhenaten effective for Aten. With a single declaration he proclaimed his allegiance not to the ancient order, but to the disk of the sun visible to all yet acknowledged by none as supreme. Names in Egypt were never mere labels. They were lives in miniature spells of protection, maps of identity. To erase or alter one was to tear at the fabric of being. Pharaohs sometimes added epithets weaving titles around their cartouches to magnify power, but to sever the name of a god entirely was a rupture. Amenhotep IV did not just rename himself, he revoked the divine patronage under which he had been born, raised and crowned. The priests of Amun must have felt the ground tremble. With one stroke their god's satisfaction turned to dismissal, their centuries of dominance suddenly placed under eclipse. The new names spread like fire across stone. Carvers re-etched cartouches, officials rehearsed their tongues to shape the new syllables, scribes dipped reeds to inscribe the dawn of Akhenaten's reign. In each stroke of ink or chisel the old order was undone. The psychology of it was profound. If the king's name could be changed, so too could the meaning of the world. Every temple, every tomb inscription, every oath sworn in Amun's name was subtly destabilized. Egypt, which prided itself on the permanence of Ma'at, the balance of truth and order, found itself wobbling on new definitions. But renaming was not enough. By his 6th year, Akhenaten resolved to abandon Thebes itself. This was no ordinary relocation. Thebes was not just a city, it was a map of Egypt's soul. Its temples enshrined the tombs of pharaohs stretching back centuries. Its avenues were carved with processions of gods who had sanctioned Egypt's rise. Its very soil was heavy with ancestral weight. To leave Thebes was to walk away from the bones of his fathers, from the cults that nourished their spirits, from the machinery of continuity that defined Egyptian kingship. The decision revealed both audacity and calculation. Psychologically, it was an act of cleansing, a rejection of compromise. As long as he ruled from Thebes, Akhenaten's vision was polluted by proximity to Amun's great house. But politically it was also an attack. By founding a new city, he would strip the priesthood of its stronghold, rerouting wealth and ritual to a virgin place. Officials, artisans and courtiers who followed him would demonstrate their loyalty not to tradition, but to his god. Imagine the whispers in palace corridors. Generals frowned. What ruler abandons the city that anchors the south, that guards ancestral tombs? Courtiers fretted over their estates tied to Theban networks. Ordinary Egyptians hearing rumours in the market must have been baffled. How could a king forsake the gods who had sustained Egypt since the world began? For the priests it was terror mixed with opportunity. Perhaps they thought the king mad and madness burns itself out. Perhaps they counted on time and inertia to undo his revolution. But for Akhenaten, renaming and relocation were not madness, but method. He was rewriting the geography of belief. To bear a name was to embody a truth. To dwell in a city was to affirm a cosmos. By discarding both, he declared that Egypt's world could be made new not by armies, but by language and place. It was a gamble that turned a theological quarrel into open defiance. A name had unmade a world. Now a city would be raised to build another. The place chosen was empty desert, a raw stretch of land where the Nile bent eastward toward cliffs that cradled the horizon. No dynastic tombs haunted its soil. No temples of rival gods commanded reverence there. It was a clean slate virgin ground for a vision that required no compromise. As dawn broke, the limestone cliffs seemed to pour fire, the sun disk climbing directly from their embrace. To Akhenaten's mind it was a natural altar, a stage built by creation itself. He named it Akhetaten Horizon of the Aten. Building a city in nothingness was an audacity even for Egypt. Yet within months the desert echoed with chisels and shouts, with sledges groaning under stone. Tens of thousands of workers arrived, stonecutters, carpenters, potters, scribes, water carriers. Camps of labourers sprang up like new villages along the riverbank. Overseers barked orders, measured out rations of bread and beer, counted baskets of rubble. Officials marked the boundaries of the new city with boundary stelae carved into the cliffs inscriptions proclaiming that this land belonged to Aten and would never serve another god. The logistics were staggering. Quarries gaped in the limestone hills, their mouths coughing out block after block. The stone was cut not in the massive slabs that built Karnak, but in smaller standardized blocks called talatat mia, measuring roughly a man's arm in length and height. Light enough for a single worker to carry, they allowed temples and palaces to rise with unprecedented speed. The decision was practical, but it was also symbolic, a new building method for a new religion, a break from the weighty permanence of Amun's monuments. The Nile became a conveyor belt. Barges ferried cedar from Lebanon, granite from Aswan, sandstone from Nubia. Along the riverbank, temporary docks bristled with the activity of unloading oxen straining against ropes, workers guiding timbers to storage yards, scribes scratching inventories onto ostraka. Imported goods fed not only construction, but daily life exotic woods for furniture, lapis and turquoise for inlays, even rare resins for incense. Egypt's empire was funneled into one project, the resources of half a continent pressed into the service of a single idea. The plan of Akhenaten was unlike Thebes or Memphis. Instead of shadowed sanctuaries, its heart was an open-air temple, vast and roofless, where the gods' rays fell without obstruction. Rows of offering tables stretched under the sky, awaiting loaves, meats, flowers, jars of beer. No hidden chamber, no priestly barrier, just light on certain stone, and the royal family at its centre. Around this, palaces and villas unfurled, connected by a royal road that sliced through the city like a spine. Akhenaten could travel from residence to temple to administrative halls without leaving the sacred precinct, a king moving within the sun's uninterrupted gaze. Yet the city was not only sacred but functional. Residential districts for officials rose quickly, their mud brick houses neatly aligned in blocks. Each had courtyards, storage rooms, painted plaster walls with scenes of marsh birds and lotus ponds. Workshops hammered out jewellery glass vessels, carved furniture. The hum of industry filled the streets, bakers tending ovens, potters firing jars, armourers sharpening bronze. Archaeological traces show a vibrant economy. Discarded fishbone seeds and fragments of imported amphorae testify to diets and trade. The city was both experiment and home. Organisation held it all together. Foremen counted labour gangs in units of 50, ration scribes issued daily tallies of bread and beer, temple administrators tracked offerings. Each task, quarrying, hauling, carving, painting, was coordinated like parts of a single machine. Egypt had always been skilled at mobilizing labor for pyramids and temples, but here the focus was not a tomb or a god of the dead. It was a living city, a capital devoted to one man's god, one man's theology. The speed was breathtaking. Within 2 years, Akhenaten stretched for miles along the Nile. Palaces with painted columns rose beside open courts, gardens were planted with imported trees, pools glimmered with Nile water diverted through canals. When the royal family arrived to take residence, the city already breathed like a living organism. Its avenues swept, its altars piled with offerings, its walls covered in fresh paint. To the priests of Amun watching from Thebes, it must have looked like a wound opening in Egypt's body. To Akhenaten, it was the beginning of a new age, a city not of shadowed sanctums but of sunlight itself. Every block laid, every offering table raised, every dawn that spilled fire across the cliffs declared the same truth, that Egypt's future, its wealth, its worship, its very geography could be redrawn in the image of a single disk in the sky. At Akhenaten, religion became choreography performed under the sky itself. No roof, no shadowed chamber, no veiled shrine. The temple was the heavens, and the stage was stone spread bare beneath the disk. Each day unfolded like a triptych of light. At dawn, the royal family emerged to greet Aten as the cliffs spilled fire. Their forms carved in reliefs that still tremble with gesture, arms lifted, heads tilted back to inhale the tiny hands of the sun that reached down to press ankhs against their nostrils. The court stood in ordered ranks behind them. Officials and priests arranged by rank, but the rays fell only on the royal family, as if the rest of Egypt were audience rather than participants. By noon the sun blazed directly overhead and the rituals swelled into fullness. Offerings crowded the long rows of open-air tables, loaves, cuts of beef, jars of beer, baskets of fruit flowers that would wither almost as soon as they were laid. Nothing was hidden. All was spectacle. Hymns rose into heat shimmering above limestone. Unlike the secretive cults of Amun, where only select priests glimpsed the god within a darkened sanctuary, Atenism made the god visible to all but mediated through the sight of the king and queen. The crowd did not look upon an image of Aten. They looked upon Akhenaten and Nefertiti bathed in Aten's rays. As evening drew in and the sun slipped toward the western horizon, the ritual softened into something mournful yet confident. Attendants swept away wilted flowers, priests poured libations, and singers intoned verses that acknowledged the disc's departure but promised its return. Darkness was temporary, a rhythm rather than a threat. The city breathed with the sun's rising and falling. Time itself became liturgy. What gave these ceremonies depth was not only their spectacle but their theology. The great hymn to the Aten inscribed in the tomb of Akhenaten's courtier A, and possibly composed by the pharaoh himself, sings not of a local god bound to a city, but of a creator whose light touches every horizon. How manifold are your works, it proclaims. O sole God like whom there is no other. You created the earth as you desired while you were alone. The hymn marvels at cattle and birds fish, and foreign peoples alike, all sustained by Aten's daily rising. It is strikingly universalist. The god's care extends not only to Egyptians, but to Syrians, Nubians, and Libyans, each granted breath by the same sun. To an ancient Egyptian steeped in the comfort of many gods, this language must have felt disorienting, even alien. Where Isis promised protection in childbirth and Osiris hope in death, Aten offered no mythology, no underworld, no stories of struggle or resurrection. Aten was pure presence, life made visible in light. For some this was liberating, for others it was unbearably austere. The only narratives were those lived by the royal family beneath the rays, their marriage, their children, their offerings, domestic scenes elevated to cosmic liturgy. Centuries later, scholars noticed curious echoes between the great hymn and Psalm 104 of the Hebrew Bible. Both speak of a God who waters the fields, feeds the beasts, makes darkness for sleep, renews the earth with dawn. Was there contact influence? Or were these simply the common intuitions of people who looked at the same sun rising above the same land? Egyptologists debate it still. Some suggest diplomatic or cultural exchange through the Levant. Others caution that parallel images can arise independently wherever the sun governs life. The connection remains tantalizing but unproven, a reminder that history offers not only facts but resonances. What cannot be doubted is the radicalism of Akhenaten's liturgy. The sun itself was God. The act of shining was miracle enough. The great temple with its altars exposed to heat and glare turned every worshipper's face upward, forced them to squint against a light that could not be controlled. If a moon's sanctuaries whispered of secrets in shadow, Aten's courts thundered of a presence that refused hiding. And day after day, as the royal family lifted offerings under the disk, Egypt's people watched awed, uneasy, uncertain whether this blaze was revelation or hubris. Akhetaten was built not as a fortress, but as a stage set for light. Where older royal residences shut the world out, high walls shadowed corridors, dim chambers that reminded courtiers of their distance from the king, this new capital invited the sun in. Windows were cut wide, their shutters painted in bright blues and greens. Courtyards opened into gardens where sycamores and tamarisks threw dappled shade across pools fed by canals from the Nile. Aviaries kept foreign birds whose cries mingled with the rustle of papyrus groves. Carp swam in ponds whose surfaces mirrored the disk above, so that Aten seemed to shine both from the sky and from the water below. In palaces, walls bloomed with painted flora lilies, mandrakes and vines, winding across plaster insects hovering, calves frisking ducks half submerged in reeds. It was a deliberate naturalism far from the solemn hunting scenes and God-filled tableau of earlier reigns. Akhenaten and Nefertiti wanted not myths in stone but life itself transposed onto architecture. To walk these halls was to stroll through an eternal spring curated by paint and irrigation channels. Gardens became extensions of liturgy, their blossoms offerings, their fragrances acts of worship. But this paradise had rules. The daily cycle of the sun governed courtly routine with exacting precision. At dawn, the royal family emerged for worship. Courtiers stood in ranks. Officials recorded offering. Her servants bustled with trays of food and flowers. By mid-morning, scribes and administrators dispersed to offices, their schedules tied to the angle of light. At noon, the temple ceremonies recommenced. No petition, no audience with the king could interrupt the sun at its zenith. In the afternoons, feasts and entertainments unfolded in shaded halls, where musicians plucked lutes and dancers turned slowly, always within reach of windows that let Aten's rays stream in. Evening rituals were quieter, but no less exacting, the entire city pivoting to face the sinking sun. What looked like beauty was also discipline. The openness of the palaces, the light, the gardens, the painted walls reminded courtiers that every gesture was performed under Aten's gaze. Unlike the old gods hidden in sanctuaries, Aten could not be secluded. His disk filled every space, demanded constant acknowledgement. Even leisure was staged. To dine in a palace garden was not merely to enjoy shade and perfume, it was to participate in a theology that equated life, pleasure, and abundance with the god's radiance. The effect was intoxicating and unsettling at once. Visitors from the provinces entered this city and found not shadowed sanctuaries but courtyards of blazing sun, not walls adorned with hieroglyphic prayers but painted marshes alive with ducks and butterflies. For some, it must have seemed a paradise, a capital where life was celebrated in its natural forms, where rulers touched their children in public, where temples had no mysteries to exclude them. For others, it may have felt like control masked in beauty, a city where every courtyard, every garden, every window insisted that the royal family alone mediated the god's light. In Akhenaten, aesthetics were not decoration but doctrine. The garden was an altar, the painted wall was scripture, the open window was confession. Court life was theatre carefully orchestrated so that every glance upward reinforced the king's claim that Aten shone for all creation, but shone most directly here upon this family, in this city drawn by the sun. In a palace drenched with light, shadows lengthened around one problem that no hymn could erase. Akhenaten had no son. Year after year, Nefertiti bore daughters 6 in all, each cradled into existence beneath the rays of Aten, each named to proclaim loyalty to the disk. Meritaten, beloved of Aten, Ankheasen-Paten. She lives for Aten. Names were theology in miniature living cartouches of the new creed. But none of the children were male, and in Egypt succession without a son meant danger. The old order could bend. Pharaohs without sons had passed rule to brothers, nephews, or even female heirs under extraordinary circumstances. But Akhenaten's revolution complicated everything. His god was singular, his theology absolute. To allow a collateral branch of the royal family, loyal perhaps to Amun or to older gods, to inherit, would risk undoing the Atenist experiment overnight. The king needed heirs who were not just royal by blood, but steeped in the creed formed under Aten's light alone. That narrowed the options to his own daughters. Reliefs from Akhenaten tell the story without words. Meritaten appears beside her father in postures once reserved for queens, accepting ankhs from the gods' rays-wearing regalia that marked her as consort as much as child. Later, Ankheasen-Paten would step into similar roles. For a people used to royal incest, brother and sister marriages had precedent. This may not have seemed utterly incomprehensible. Yet the systematic elevation of daughters to queenly status pressed the logic to its limit. The political reasoning was clear: keep succession within the nuclear family, prevent rivals from claiming legitimacy, secure continuity for Aten's cult. The theological justification was more daring. Aten in hymns was both father and mother, source of all creation, without molded need of partner. If the god could generate life from itself, why should the royal family, the divine microcosm on earth, not mirror this unity? By joining father to daughter, Akhenaten enacted in flesh the god's self-sufficiency. In theory, it was a powerful symbol the dynasty contained within itself, all that was needed to renew Egypt under Aten's gaze. But symbols have human costs. Meritaten, perhaps only in her mid-teens, was drawn into roles that blurred daughter and consort, child and mother. Ankheasen-Paten younger still followed. The tender family scenes that once charmed children climbing onto laps, parents kissing their daughters, took on a darker undertone when the same daughters reappeared in queenly crowns beside the same father. What had been intimacy now looked like necessity painted as theology but lived as trauma. Inside the palace, anxiety must have gnawed. Could these unions produce a male heir? Would Aten bless the experiment with a son, or was the god as silent as the older deities the king had rejected? Meanwhile, courtiers watched uneasily, trapped between loyalty to the king and fear of a succession crisis. The army needed clarity. Foreign vassals demanded assurance. And the priests of Amun, still nursing their losses in silence, surely noted every whisper of uncertainty. The gamble of endogamy carried more than political risk. Inbreeding, though long practiced in royal houses, could magnify frailty. Modern science would later uncover skeletal deformities and evidence of genetic disorders in the Amarna line legacies of a dynasty's desperate bid to keep divinity pure. But in Akhenaten's day, the dangers were already visible in youthful deaths in daughters lost before maturity and childbirth, scenes carved in tombs where mourning attendants surrounded royal girls too young to die. The ethnicist creed had promised light, clarity and renewal, yet in the heart of the palace succession was forced into contortions that weighed heavily on those least able to choose the daughters. Theology proclaimed them embodiments of divine favour. Politics cast them as safeguards of revolution. But behind the golden crowns and painted reliefs, they were children asked to bear the weight of a dynasty and a god their lives turned into arguments that the sun itself was enough. Among the painted fragments and carved reliefs of Amarna, some images still radiate warmth, the king kissing a child, Nefertiti smiling as her daughters tug at her jewellery. Yet others chill even across 3,000 years. They are the images where tenderness turns to necessity and necessity to tragedy. Aten was the first to cross that threshold. In early reliefs she is shown as a lively princess, hair bound in a sidelock of youth reaching for her parents. But by the 13th year of Akhenaten's reign, she appears in full queenly regalia, the tall blue crown, the broad collar, the pose of a consort. She stands beside her father, not as child but as partner, receiving Aten's life-giving rays as his equal. What once seemed a domestic tableau has shifted into dynastic theatre. The princess who had clambered onto her father's lap now stood beside him in a role freighted with political urgency. Soon it was Ankhesempaten's turn. Barely into adolescence, she too was elevated, depicted in scenes that cast her as great royal wife. Reliefs show her beneath Aten's rays, hands raised in gestures that mimic Nefertiti's from earlier years. Yet her youth is unmistakable, the rounded face, the delicate frame. To modern eyes, the dissonance is disturbing, an image of a child pressed into a role that demanded both ritual and conjugal weight. To Akhenaten it may have been theology in action, the royal household mirroring Aten's self-sufficient creation. To the girls themselves it was a burden that art records only in silence. The most haunting scene, however, belongs to Aten. In the royal tomb at Amarna, one chamber preserves reliefs unlike any others in Egypt. They show a young princess on a birthing bed. Attendants rushing mourners raising their arms in grief. Beside her a nurse holds a swaddled infant. The next panel shows the child gone and the court engulfed in lamentation. Scholars debate the details. Was the dead woman truly Meketaten's second daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti? Was the infant her child, possibly by her father, possibly by another member of the royal house? The evidence cannot settle the questions, but the scene itself speaks plainly. A young girl, scarcely more than 15, died in childbirth, her body carried to eternity amid ritual grief. To dwell on that chamber is to be reminded of the brutal realities of the ancient world. Maternal mortality haunted every household. Childbirth was as perilous as battle. For adolescent mothers, the risks multiplied. Pelvic bones, not yet matured, immune systems still fragile. They faced odds weighted against survival. The royal family, despite its palaces and physicians, was not exempt. Even with midwives' prayers and incense, death entered the birthing room as often as life. Meketaten's tragedy was not unique, it was common across the Nile Valley. But what makes it unbearable is the weight of theology that may have pressed her into such peril, the demand that dynastic purity and divine symbolism override the youth of her body. The reliefs are raw in their emotional force, figures wail with hands to heads, the king and queen are shown mourning, with gestures rarely carved for rulers. It is as if the artists freed by Amarna's style to depict real human sorrow poured their grief into stone. Unlike the calm, timeless funerary scenes of earlier tombs, these images record a moment of crisis, a death not abstracted but painfully specific. For archaeologists, these panels remain among the most unsettling images of Egyptian art. For the people of Amarna, they must have been shattering proof that even the royal family blessed by Aten's rays could not escape the old harsh arithmetic of life and death. Theology had promised clarity, light, a God who sustained all creatures. But here was darkness at the very centre of Aten's chosen household, a child queen lost to the dangers of the very role forced upon her. Akhenaten's experiment had sought to redefine the cosmos. The reliefs in Meketaten's chamber remind us that the human body, frail and mortal, does not bend so easily to ideology. Beneath the rays of the sun, daughters could be crowned as queens, but in the birthing room they were still girls vulnerable to the same risks that claimed countless mothers across the Nile. In a dusty archive chamber at Amarna, hundreds of clay tablets once lay stacked, their wedge-shaped impressions pressed by foreign scribes in distant cities. These were the voices of empire, the Amarna letters, and together they reveal how the world beyond Egypt's sunlit courtyards was beginning to unravel. While Akhenaten bent all his energy to Aten's liturgy, his vassals wrote in desperation their pleas hardened in clay and sent down caravan routes toward a king who seldom answered. To the king, my lord, my god, my son, begins one letter from Rib-Hadda of Byblos, a city-state on the Levantine coast. The words fall into formula at first as etiquette required. 7 times and 7 times I fall at the feet of the king my lord. But then comes the urgency. All my cities have deserted me. The enemy presses me close. If there are no archers this year, then all the lands of the king my lord will perish. His words are not metaphor. Enemy coalitions pressed Byblos hard, and without Egyptian soldiers, Rib-Hadda knew his city could not hold. From Jerusalem came the voice of Abdi-Heber May, the king send archers to his servants. Without the king's troops, the lands of the king will be lost. I am like a ship in the midst of the sea. He describes attacks by Habiru raiders, rebels whose exact identity still puzzles historians, bands of dispossessed mercenaries, migrants or proto-Israelite tribes. Whoever they were, they cut into Egypt's fragile grip on Canaan. Abdi-Heber begged for men for weapons for recognition. He received little more than words. Meanwhile, the great kingdom of Mitanni, Egypt's ally and buffer against the Hittites, began to collapse. Letters from its rulers grow increasingly strained, lamenting Hittite incursions across their borders. They have seized my cities, one ruler writes, and there is no one to rescue them. Send chariots, my brother, before I am lost. But the Hittites, disciplined and ambitious, were relentless. Without Egypt's support, Mitanni buckled, leaving the Hittites free to dominate northern Syria. To read these letters is to hear a chorus of loyalty turning to fear. They call Akhenaten Lord soon my God, but the words curdle into bitterness. Rib-Hadda writes letter after letter, more than 50 survive, yet no army ever comes. In one late tablet his tone sharpens. Why do you neglect your land? Send men or all will fall into the hand of the enemy. Soon after Byblos fell, inside Egypt the contrast was stark. While the Levant bled, Akhenaten was absorbed in ritual cycles at Akhenaten sunrise hymns as midday offerings, sunset libations. He built colonnades and courtyards, opened new tombs, composed poetry to the disk. He redirected wealth to altars, not armies. The same empire that his father Amenhotep III had stabilized through marriage alliances, garrisons and diplomacy was now crumbling at its edges. Egypt's neighbours saw the difference. The Hittites began to speak of Egypt not with fear, but with scorn. The letters testify to a ruler detached from the realities of empire. Whether from conviction that Aten would sustain Egypt or from indifference to foreign entanglements, Akhenaten left his vassals to fend for themselves. The clay tablets piled up in archives that later collapsed into dust unread in their own time. Today their wedge-shaped cries preserve the sound of an empire fraying not with a single invasion but with neglect. The sun blazed above Aten, but beyond its glare Egypt's grip on the world was loosening one unanswered plea at a time. For the courtiers of Akhenaten, life revolved around sunlight ritual and the royal family's daily choreography. But outside the capital's carefully painted gardens, Egypt's millions lived by rhythms older and more intimate. Here, Aten's revolution found little purchase. Religion for ordinary Egyptians was not austere philosophy. It was festival days when processions of Amun's bark wound through Thebes, when drums and sistrums shook the air, when beer flowed and roasted geese filled the courtyards. It was Isis invoked in childbirth. Bez painted on bedroom walls to scare away demons, Ptah whispered. Two by craftsmen before they set chisel to stone, these gods were close, practical and responsive. They promised protection in daily risks, healing in illness and guidance after death. Aten, by contrast, was distant, abstract and mediated only through the king and queen. The sun's rays fell everywhere, but Aten spoke only to the palace. Festivals vanished under Akhenaten's decrees. The joyous gatherings where people danced, sang and feasted in the god's company were cancelled or replaced with ceremonies that centred exclusively on Aten and the royal family. For the people, this was not just a loss of devotion, but of community celebration and hope. The cycle of holidays that marked the agricultural year was broken. In its place came dry, repetitive rituals that ordinary Egyptians could only watch, never join. Archaeology tells the quiet story of resistance. In workmen's villages at Amarna, small clay figurines of household gods, Isis nursing Horus Bes, with his grotesque grin, still appear. Amulets of Taweret, the hippo goddess of childbirth, were worn by mothers who could not risk their lives on Aten's aloof blessing. In provincial tombs, traditional prayers and invocations continued to be carved even as official inscriptions praised Aten. The people bent publicly but clung privately to the gods who had always heard them. Economic strain deepened the alienation. When Akhenaten redirected wealth from Amun's temples to Aten's provincial workshops and estates tied to the old priesthood suffered. Craftsmen who had once produced statues of Osiris or gilded shrines for Amun found their markets gone. Farmers whose grain had been tithed to local temples now had to send shipments to the new capital hundreds of miles away. The redistribution of wealth drained resources from villages and towns that had thrived on temple economies for generations. Whispers spread in marketplaces, crops failing because Amun was angered, illness striking because Isis had been dishonoured the Nile low because the gods had turned their faces away. Such explanations were woven into Egyptian life, and Aten offered no comforting counterweight. Where Osiris promised eternal fields, Aten's theology offered no clear afterlife. Where Isis soothed the frightened, Aten shone impersonally on all, with no prayers to bend his will. So the people adapted. In public they might attend Aten's rituals, bowing as the royal family raised offerings to the disk. In private they tucked figurines of protective gods into corners of their homes, whispered old prayers before sleep buried their dead with charms invoking the familiar pantheon. Egypt became two kingdoms at once, the kingdom of Aten painted bright and orderly in Amarna, and the kingdom of the old gods persistent in kitchens, workshops and provincial shrines. Akhenaten's revolution had sought to erase plurality in favour of unity, but among the people plurality endured. The sun rose each morning and they accepted it. Yet in the shadow of its glare they kept alive the gods who spoke their language of joy, fear and hope. Quietly, stubbornly, they maintained a countercurrent waiting for the day when official theology would collapse and the festivals of old would return to fill Egypt's streets once more. By the later years of Akhenaten's reign, the art that had once startled Egypt with intimacy and freshness began to harden into mannerism. Early reliefs showed tender gestures, Nefertiti cupping her husband's chin, daughters tugging at his necklace. Now images repeated with mechanical insistence, the royal family beneath Aten's raised hands raised ankhs pressed to their lips. Workshop after workshop turned out the same scene, the same poses, until what had been revolutionary became rote. The king's likeness also grew stranger. Where earlier portrayals had hinted at elongation narrow limbs, drooping chin-wide hips, the late sculptures exaggerated them into caricature. Statues show him with pendulous breasts, swollen belly, elongated skull. Was this deliberate theology a visual manifesto of Aten's androgynous creative force? Or was it a distorted reflection of the king's failing health, perhaps magnified by inbreeding and genetic frailty? Either way, the images unsettled contemporaries. This was no muscular pharaoh striding with bow in hand. This was a body that seemed to defy category, neither wholly male nor female human, nor divine. Around the 14th year of his reign, another figure flickered briefly onto the stage, Smenkhkare. His identity remains one of Egyptology's puzzles. Was he Akhenaten's younger brother, his son by a secondary wife, perhaps even Nefertiti under a new name elevated as co-ruler? The records are sparse, the evidence contradictory. Reliefs show him in kingly regalia, sometimes paired with Meritaten as consort. A few inscriptions grant him full royal titles, yet within a year or two he vanishes. Did he die young? Was he erased, or was his reign absorbed into the tangle of succession that would soon engulf Amarna? Meanwhile, the city itself began to betray fatigue. Excavations of Amarna's residential quarters reveal abandonment. Houses once painted with birds and lotus wilted into disrepair. Workshops where artisans had crafted delicate jewellery and lifelike reliefs shuttered, their floors littered with broken tools. Trash pits grew, but storerooms emptied. The population, which may have peaked at 30,000 to 50,000 in the city's prime, seems to have dwindled as food grew scarce and wages shrank. Archaeological evidence speaks of malnutrition. Skeletons from Amarna's cemeteries show signs of stunted growth, spinal injuries from heavy labour anemia. These were not the pampered courtiers of the palace, but the workers who bore the cost of building paradise. Their bones reveal shortened lives, their teeth lines of childhood stress. For them, Aten's light offered no relief from toil. Inside the palaces, anxiety thickened. Foreign letters piled unanswered. Mitanni had crumbled, the Hittites surged, vassal kings defected. Egypt's empire was shrinking while its king wrote hymns and staged ceremonies. Courtiers who had once thrilled at the daring of Amarna must have begun to doubt. Murmurs spread perhaps Aten's power was not enough, perhaps the old gods had withdrawn their favour. By then the very air of the city carried a sense of fragility. The wide roads still cut straight to the temples, but fewer chariots rattled over them. The great Aten temple still blazed under noon sun, but its altars received fewer offerings. The royal family was still carved in stone, but the images were tired, recycled, stripped of earlier warmth. Akhenaten's revolution, once burning with creative fire, had cooled into orthodoxy without joy. For the king, this late phase may have felt like vindication proof that Aten's order had stabilized, that his vision was secure. For those who lived it, the signs told another story, a city decaying before its time, an empire neglected, and a ruler whose body and image seemed to reflect not transcendence but decline. The dream of eternal sunlight was beginning to flicker. In the 17th year of his reign, the man who had renamed himself Akhenaten simply disappears from the record. No dramatic deathbed scene survives, no triumphal inscription of passage into eternity, no carved relief of a king welcomed by Aten's rays into the afterlife. The silence is striking. For a pharaoh who had filled his city with images of himself and his family, the absence of his own ending is almost louder than any words could be. What we know is fragmentary. His cartouches cease, inscriptions that once repeated his name endlessly fall quiet. Administrative tablets record the presence of successors, first the shadowy Smenkhare, then perhaps Nefertiti under another name, then the children he left behind. But the moment of his death itself is a blank. Speculation has filled the void. Some scholars suggest illness, his elongated body hinting at genetic disorders such as Marfan syndrome or endocrine disease conditions that might shorten life and weaken health. Others point to the accumulated toll of stress, years of resisting entrenched priesthoods, ignoring foreign crises, and forcing a revolution onto reluctant subjects. Still others propose the simple truth of mortality, an infection, a fever, an accident. Ancient Egypt was no stranger to sudden death, even for kings with physicians and luxuries at their call. What is certain is that he died relatively young, likely in his mid-30s. Old enough to have reshaped Egypt's religion and politics, too young to secure the succession of his revolution. His daughters were still girls, his queen's fate uncertain, his co-regent gone, or fading from the record. The palace that had relied on his presence to mediate Aten's light was suddenly without its conduit. For a theology built on one man's vision, that absence was catastrophic. The political vacuum yawned immediately. Who could claim legitimacy? Smenkhare, if still alive, was little more than a name, his identity debated even then. Nefertiti Long, the visible queen, may have stepped into power as Nefer-Nefer-Aten, but her reign was brief, shadowy, and contested. The daughters raised as symbols of Aten's favour were too young, their positions precarious. The army, neglected through years of ritual absorption, lacked clear direction. The priests of Aten had authority only so long as the king embodied it. Without him, their power thinned like smoke in the wind. To the courtiers who had staked their fortunes on Akhenaten's vision, the king's death must have felt like the floor giving way. The great hymn had sung of Aten as eternal, sustaining all peoples, all lands. But if Aten was eternal, why did his prophet vanish without ceremony, leaving his city already crumbling, his empire already frayed? The question hung heavy, though unspoken. Outside the capital, the old gods had never been fully silenced. Their cults persisted in quiet, their priests waiting. To them, news of the heretic's death must have arrived like the first breeze before a storm. The revolution had been a blaze of light, but it had burned through too quickly, and now darkness or restoration was at hand. Akhenaten's end was not a spectacle, but an absence, a vanishing. He had promised a new order of sunlit clarity, but he left behind confusion and fragility. His god still rose each morning, but his city was already faltering, his dynasty unravelling and his revolution sliding into history's silence. After Akhenaten's sudden disappearance, the throne passed through a haze of shadows. A name appears in inscriptions. Nefer-Nefer-Aten, perhaps Nefertiti ruling under a new titulary, perhaps a daughter elevated to preserve the creed. Whoever bore it, the reign was brief, little more than a gasp before the tide turned. Aten's experiment had lost its prophet. Without his voice, the system faltered. Within a year or two, the old order began to reassert itself. Into this fragile moment stepped a child Tutankhaten. Barely 9 years old, he inherited a kingdom exhausted by religious upheaval and foreign neglect. His very name declared the problem living image of Aten, a title no longer safe to bear. Under the guidance of senior officials, the boy's name was altered to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun. In a single stroke, Aten was dethroned, and the god who had been banished reclaimed his place. Behind the child king stood two men who understood both the danger and the opportunity: the seasoned courtier who had long served the royal family, and Horemheb, the general whose command of Egypt's armies gave him muscle. Together they steered the ship of state back into familiar waters. Temples shuttered under Akhenaten were reopened. Offerings once again piled before Amun-Ptah and Osiris. Estates confiscated for Aten's cult were returned to their old priesthoods, restoring the economic lifeblood of provinces and workshops. Diplomacy too was mended. Letters went out to foreign rulers reassuring them that Egypt had not abandoned its allies that tribute, and marriages could once again proceed under the old god's watch. Where Akhenaten had ignored pleas for archers, Tutankhamun's regents dispatched soldiers to secure the frontiers. Egypt's prestige, though battered, began to recover under the promise of continuity. The regime justified this reversal with solemn rhetoric. On the restoration. Stela at Karnak carved in the young king's name, the voice of the state explained what had happened during the Amarna years. The temples of the gods and goddesses from Elephantine to the Delta marshes had fallen into ruin. Their shrines had become overgrown with weeds, their sanctuaries as if they had never been. If one prayed to a god to seek counsel, he would not come. If one beseeched a goddess, she would not come at all. The land was topsy-turvy, and the gods turned their backs upon this land. The stela frames Akhenaten's reign, not simply as error, but as cosmic disorder. By neglecting the gods, it claimed the king had unbalanced Ma'at, the divine order of truth and harmony. Restoration was presented not as innovation, but as healing, a return to the natural rhythm. In this narrative, Tutankhamun was not a child manipulated by elders, but the chosen instrument through whom Egypt's wounds were bound up. For the people, the return of festivals must have felt like rain after drought. Processions once more filled the streets, incense thickened the air, and the familiar deities came out of their sanctuaries to mingle with the crowd. Bread, beer, and song flowed again. Ordinary Egyptians had endured Aten's abstract light with resignation, but here were gods who listened, who comforted, who promised the afterlife fields of Osiris. In the restored temples, priests reclaimed their wealth and their dignity. Craftsmen returned to carving traditional statues, scribes to inscribing familiar hymns. Even art shifted back to idealized forms: kings with strong jaws, queens with aloof grace, gods with falcons and jackals and crowns. The domestic tenderness of Amarna vanished, replaced by the eternal masks of tradition. The restorers did not linger on Akhenaten's name. Better to bury it under silence. Tutankhamun I and Horemheb presented themselves not as innovators, but as repairers of a breach. They had restored Egypt's balance, secured its future, and reminded its people that order could always be rebuilt. But under the surface, the memory of Amarna lingered, a warning, a curiosity, and a whisper of what happens when one man dares to pull the sun into his hands. When Horemheb finally secured the throne, he set about not only restoring Egypt's stability, but also scrubbing clean the memory of the man who had imperiled it. To erase Akhenaten was to cauterize a wound. The method was brutal, but it was not chaos. It was policy. Temples, palaces, tombs all bore the marks of chisels and hammers to his tasked with excising a god who no longer had the right to exist. Cartouches carrying Akhenaten's names were the first to go. Workers moved methodically across walls, striking at the ovals that once enclosed effective for Aten. A gouged hollow where a name had been was more than vandalism. In Egyptian belief, the written name anchored the soul in eternity. To destroy it was to inflict the second death, the death of memory. Without his name to be read or spoken, Akhenaten's spirit would wither forgotten in the halls of the afterlife. For a king who had once dared to redefine divinity itself, this fate was annihilation of the most complete kind. Statues fared no better. Images of Akhenaten with elongated skull, narrowed chest, and wide hips, once startling proclamations of a new theology, were toppled, smashed, their fragments carted away. Heads were separated from bodies, faces from crowns. Some fragments were ground down for reuse, others were buried as rubble in new foundations. The physical body of the heretic king was shattered into anonymity. Even the very stones of Amarna were repurposed. The Talatat blocks, small and easy to transport, proved too practical to waste. Horemheb's builders carted them off, stacking them inside the pylons of new temples at Karnak and elsewhere. To walk those sanctuaries today is to walk past hidden ghosts inside their walls. Atenist reliefs lie face to face, sealed in darkness, their bright colours never meant to be seen again. The city that Akhenaten built as horizon of the sun was reduced to filler for monuments to the gods he had scorned. The king lists too were rewritten. Scribes carefully copied dynastic successions, but when they reached Amenhotep III, they skipped directly to Horemheb as though the 18 years of Akhenaten's reign had never existed. Official history became seamless, a narrative without rupture. To future generations, the heretic would be invisible, lost between lines, denied the immortality that every pharaoh had craved. Why erasure and not martyrdom? Because the danger was not Akhenaten's heresy itself, it was the memory of it. A condemned king might inspire rebellion. A remembered heretic might tempt others to imagine the same sunlit clarity. Forgetting was safer. To condemn him in stone would have kept his name alive. To blot him out was to kill his god altogether. Aten could not be denounced without risk of reviving him. Better to silence him, to strip him of breath in texts and images, until even the people's whispers dwindled. And so the purge was thorough. What began as hammer blows in Karnak and Amarna spread across Egypt until Akhenaten was reduced to rumour. Only in the sand, sealed away from official hands, did fragments of his world survive. Talatat hidden inside pylons, tombs, never fully completed scraps of him on crumbling plaster. For more than 3 millennia his god lay erased, his revolution extinguished not by argument but by absence. To kill a god in Egypt, one did not strike him down in battle. One starved him of the memory. Akhenaten's fate was not to be cursed but to be forgotten, and in a culture where remembrance was eternity, that was the most devastating death of all. For more than 3,000 years, silence held. Akhenaten's city crumbled into dust, his god's temples lay open to the sky, his very name erased from king lists and inscriptions. Travellers passed the limestone cliffs that once framed Akhenaten's horizon, without knowing a capital had ever lived there. His revolution survived only as absence, a gap in memory. It was not until the 19th century, when European explorers and archaeologists began to probe Egypt's sands, that the ghost stirred again. At Amarna, they found fragments of a vanished world. The ground was littered with the small Talatat blocks recycled from Aten's temples, some still carrying vivid colours, rays ending in tiny hands, royal daughters with elongated limbs, Akhenaten himself in poses unlike any other pharaoh. In tombs, the great hymn to the Aten was rediscovered, its verses glowing with universalism. The Amarna letters emerged from ruined archives tablets still bearing wedge-shaped appeals from desperate vassals. Piece by piece, scholars reassembled a story that the ancients had tried to obliterate. What emerged shocked even the modern world. Here was a pharaoh who had dared to overturn 3 millennia of tradition, who had elevated one god above hundreds, who had built a city from nothing and abandoned it within a generation. Some hailed him as the world's first monotheist, a prophet before prophets. Others cautioned that his revolution was less theology than politics, by replacing a sprawling priesthood with devotion centered solely on himself and his family. Akhenaten may have sought not religious truth but absolute control. The debate continues. Was he a visionary staring into the sun and hearing its voice, or a zealot whose obsession destabilized an empire? Perhaps both. Science added new layers. In the early 21st century, DNA analysis of mummies revealed the tangled genetics of the Amarna dynasty. Tutankhamun, long celebrated as the boy king of Egypt's golden treasure, was shown to be the child of siblings, almost certainly Akhenaten and a sister wife. His skeleton bore the marks of frailty, clubfoot, cleft palate, traces of malaria. In his bones, the cost of dynastic purity was inscribed. The dream of keeping divinity within a single bloodline had produced fragility instead. The revolution's biological toll mirrored its political one. And yet fascination endures. To walk at Amarna today is to step across wide avenues that go nowhere to stand amid ruined foundations where palaces once gleamed with painted gardens. The cliffs still catch the sunrise exactly as Akhenaten intended, the horizon still blazing with Aten's daily miracle. But the city is silent, a reminder of how swiftly even grand visions can dissolve. The legacy of Akhenaten is not simply that of a failed heretic. It is a warning about the peril and allure of remaking a civilization in one lifetime. His vision promised clarity, but it demanded the erasure of gods beloved by millions, the restructuring of economies, the bending of children into dynastic pawns. For a moment he seemed to succeed temples roofless to the sky, hymns praising a universal creator, a city blazing with sunlight. And yet the cost was borne by the living, by vassals left unprotected, by workers whose bones show hunger and strain, by daughters pressed into roles too heavy for their years. Archaeology has lifted him from oblivion, but it has also shown the fragility of his revolution. Memory is a stubborn force chiseled away in one age, resurrected in another. Today Akhenaten stands as both caution and curiosity, the pharaoh who tried to capture the sun. He remains proof that a single life can redirect the course of history, but also that history has a way of reclaiming its balance, even if it takes 3,000 years. The story of Akhenaten and his doomed revolution in light has the texture of myth, but it was lived by men, women and children who bore its weight. From the chisels erasing his name to the hymns he composed to the sun, we glimpse not only the reach of ambition, but also the limits of human endurance. What lessons can we take from this tale of God's unmade cities abandoned and memories erased? The first lesson is that vision alone is never enough. Akhenaten saw a truth others did not, or perhaps only he believed it with such force that one god visible in the sky should eclipse all others. He reimagined temples, rewrote names, and built a capital from dust. But without persuading the people, without addressing their daily hopes and fears, the vision remained hollow. Festivals vanished, household gods were banned, but mothers still whispered prayers to Isis in private, craftsmen still invoked tar before they carved. Change imposed without resonance with lived experience is brittle. In our own lives, whether in leadership, community or family, ideas only endure if they meet people where they are. Second power cannot be sustained by erasure. Akhenaten tried to kill Amun, not with argument, but with subordinates chiseling names, banning rituals, redistributing wealth. Later Horemheb used the same tools against Akhenaten, consigning him to the second death of forgetting. Yet 3,000 years later, fragments from Amarna still speak. History resists deletion. Likewise, in our time, attempts to erase inconvenient truths or silence uncomfortable voices rarely succeed. Memory, even buried, has a way of resurfacing. True stability lies not in suppression, but in reckoning honestly with what is. Third, the cost of a single life's ambition often falls on others. Akhenaten's daughters became pawns in his succession crisis, married too young, some perhaps dying in childbirth. His workers left bones scarred with hunger and labour. His empire's vassals begged in vain for soldiers while he composed hymns. Every bold project asks someone to carry its weight. It is a reminder to weigh our dreams against their impact on those around us. Ambition without compassion risks becoming tyranny. Fourth, fragility often hides beneath grandeur. The wide avenues of Aten. The hymns carved in stone, the painted gardens, these promised permanence, yet within a generation they lay in ruin. Tutankhamun's body, frail from inbreeding, carried the dynasty's contradictions in his bones. We too may build structures of confidence, businesses, reputations, even nations that look solid but crumble if they lack depth, resilience, and adaptability. True strength is not in spectacle but in foundations that can endure change. Finally, Akhenaten's story reminds us that legacy is never fully in our control. He tried to bind eternity to a single god, yet what survives is not Aten's theology but the cautionary tale of its rise and fall. We cannot dictate how the future will remember us. What we can do is live in ways that honour both vision and humanity, that balance daring with care, and that leave behind not ruins but resilience. In the end, Akhenaten's sun still rises over Amarna's cliffs, each dawn indifferent to forgotten hymns and shattered temples. The light remains, but it shines equally on memory and oblivion. For us the lesson is clear. What endures is not grand declarations, but the everyday choices that respect truth, nurture community and sustain life beneath the unblinking sky. Thank you, subscribe now and don't miss what's to come.